Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Drew had chosen a path of vengeance so corrosive that it consumed every ounce of logic he once possessed, and in his obsession, he decided that his target would not be Curtis directly but Stella. The decision itself was a cruel reflection of just how far he had fallen. Instead of standing face to face with Curtis like a man willing to fight his battles in the open, he diverted his anger onto someone who had neither the strength nor the power to resist him. Stella became the pawn in his calculated scheme, her name deliberately dragged into the mire of fraudulent insurance claims. She had never imagined that her act of kindness toward Martin, an attempt to help him navigate through complicated hospital bureaucracy, would be twisted into the narrative of a crime. What should have been a minor clerical favor was now painted as a federal offense. It was as though Drew had sharpened his blade not for his rival, but for an innocent woman whose only crime was loyalty. The consequences were devastating. The very foundation of Stella's life, her good name, her trust within the community, and her bond with her family crumbled in the aftermath. Neighbors whispered, friends turned their eyes away, and even those closest to her seemed unable to silence the gnawing doubt that the accusations had planted. Stella, a woman once respected as the moral compass of her family, suddenly found herself treated like a criminal. She walked through her days with the invisible weight of judgment pressing down on her chest, and her nights were restless, haunted by the fear that at any moment a knock on the door would take her away in handcuffs. For a woman already vulnerable in age and health, this psychological warfare was almost as lethal as the stroke that loomed just over her horizon. Curtis, despite his anger toward Drew, could not erase the damage that had been done. His rage boiled over into threats, confrontations, and desperate attempts to shield Stella, but Drew's cruelty thrived on Curtis's helplessness. Every time Curtis tried to intervene, Drew retaliated with greater force, weaving new allegations, whispering new lies, and ensuring that Stella's name remained chained to scandal. It was an endless loop of persecution. Curtis had always carried himself as a man of strength and conviction, yet even he felt powerless against Drew's vindictiveness. The man he once considered an adversary had transformed into something darker, someone who cared nothing for collateral damage. And in Drew's eyes, Stella was nothing more than collateral. But the true devastation for Stella did not come solely from Drew's machinations. It struck from within her own family, from the revelation that Portia had been unfaithful. For a woman like Stella, who had devoted her life to protecting her loved ones and maintaining a sense of unity among them, the discovery was shattering. It was not simply a betrayal of vows, it was a betrayal of the family's fragile stability at a time when they could least afford it. Stella's heart, already weakened by stress, could not endure the weight of disappointment and shame. It was as though her body reacted violently to the knowledge, as though the betrayal itself had poisoned her blood and attacked her heart. The moment the truth became undeniable, her body collapsed under the pressure, and she was struck down by a sudden, merciless stroke. The sight of Stella crumpled on the floor left the household in chaos. Curtis, torn between fury and guilt, rushed to her side, his hands trembling as he tried to keep her conscious. The once formidable woman who had always held her family together now lay fragile and silent, her breathing labored, her future uncertain. The paramedics carried her away, but the damage was done. Drew's vengeance had already pushed her to the brink, and Portia's betrayal had driven her over the edge. It was a convergence of cruelty and weakness, and Stella became the unwilling sacrifice in a battle she never asked to fight. Her hospitalization became a grim reminder that vengeance and betrayal always claim the innocent first. Stella was trapped between two storms, Drew's relentless persecution, and the crumbling foundation of her family. Her collapse symbolized the destruction of more than just her body. It was the collapse of trust, of loyalty, of the very principles she had lived by. What haunted everyone left behind was the possibility that Stella might never recover, that her voice might be silenced forever, leaving the truth about Drew's manipulations and Portia's infidelity locked away in the fragile body of a woman who had already given too much. The moment Stella collapsed was one that etched itself into the very marrow of Curtis's bones. Time seemed to fracture as he watched her body falter, her face drained of color, her limbs heavy and lifeless in his arms. He shouted her name, his voice cracking under the weight of panic, as if sheer desperation could anchor her to life. The shrill cry of the ambulance sirens tore through the night, filling the Ashford home with a sense of dread that would linger long after Stella was carried away. For Curtis, the sound was not only an alarm of medical urgency but the tolling of a bell marking the disintegration of everything he had struggled to preserve: his family, his marriage, his sanity. Stella's collapse left behind a wound deeper than flesh, a gash that bled into the very soul of those who loved her. At the hospital, Stella's fragile body lay ensnared by tubes and monitors, her chest rising and falling in an uneven rhythm. Each shallow breath seemed to echo the fragility of her life, as if she hovered precariously between two worlds. Curtis paced the sterile corridors, torn between fury and helplessness, his mind replaying the avalanche of betrayals that had led them here. Yet ironically, the one who became her caregiver during this vulnerable stage was Isaiah, a man whose motives were anything but pure. He presented himself as compassionate, attentive, and trustworthy. Behind the polished facade was a calculated predator who saw opportunity in vulnerability. Isaiah's visits to Stella's bedside were not acts of kindness but acts of manipulation. He spoke softly, in tones that should have soothed, but instead, his words carried poison. He reminded Stella of her family's turmoil, invoked her fears, whispered names and betrayals that clawed at her conscience. In her weakened state, unable to discern reality from dream, Stella became trapped in nightmares he deliberately fed. Her mind conjured distorted visions of Curtis abandoning her, Portia betraying her, and Drew condemning Harold, magnified under Isaiah's subtle hand. Instead of bringing her peace, Isaiah ensured her nights were racked with terror, so that Curtis, when he came to see her, would find her trembling, broken, and consumed with guilt. To Isaiah, it was the perfect storm. Stella's suffering became Curtis's burden, and Curtis's despair pushed him further from stability, leaving space for Isaiah to tighten his grip on Portia. Portia, meanwhile, drifted deeper into her own internal chaos. The walls of her marriage had already cracked under the weight of secrets and mistrust, and now they threatened to collapse entirely. Curtis's anger at Drew, his obsession with protecting Stella, and his inability to trust Portia left her stranded in isolation. Into that void stepped Isaiah, with his carefully rehearsed gentleness, his ability to listen at just the right moments, his way of making Portia feel seen when she most needed validation. Where Curtis was hard and distant, Isaiah was warm and attentive. It was a cruel illusion, but to Portia, in her loneliness, it felt like salvation. The night it happened, the atmosphere itself seemed to conspire with Isaiah's intentions. The hospital lights dimmed, the silence stretched, and within that silence, Portia's defenses weakened. She tried to hold on to the remnants of her vows, the image of her family, but the ache of abandonment was stronger. Isaiah leaned closer, his voice laced with sympathy, his hands steady and reassuring. One moment bled into the next, and soon sympathy blurred into intimacy. When Portia finally surrendered, it was not out of love but out of desperation, a need to fill the cavern of loneliness that Curtis's absence had carved within her. As their passion consumed the room, the symbolic unraveling of her marriage became undeniable. The wedding ring slipped from Portia's trembling hand, clattering onto the cold tile floor. It lay there, lifeless and broken, beside the shattered remnants of a framed wedding photograph that had once embodied hope and unity. That ring, once a promise of forever, was now a relic of something that had crumbled irreparably. The room reeked of betrayal, not only against Curtis but against everything Portia had once believed she could preserve. Isaiah, triumphant, regarded the moment as his victory. He had ensnared Portia, weakened Curtis, and reduced Stella to a vessel of fear and frailty. The Ashford family, once strong, was fractured beyond recognition, and Isaiah stood at the center of the wreckage. Yet beneath his calculated triumph lurked an uneasy truth. Stella, though weakened, still lived. Her fragile breaths carried the possibility of recovery, the possibility that she might rise again, not only to heal but to speak the truths Isaiah had worked so hard to bury. For now, however, the silence favored him, and the devastation he had orchestrated settled like a shroud over Curtis's world. Isaiah's false triumph settled over Fairview like a suffocating fog, a slow and steady poison that seeped into every fracture of the Ashford family. He carried himself like a man who had won a war without ever lifting a sword, content to watch as Curtis crumbled beneath the weight of betrayal, loss, and humiliation. To the outside world, Isaiah appeared as a savior, steady hand at Stella's bedside, a sympathetic ear for Portia, a figure of strength in a moment when the family was unraveling. Yet behind that facade lay a darker truth. He was no rescuer, he was the architect of their misery, the one who had taken advantage of Stella's vulnerability, twisted her mind with nightmares, and seduced Portia in her most fragile hour. For him, the pieces fit perfectly together. For Curtis, everything lay in ruin. Curtis spent sleepless nights wandering between the sterile glow of the hospital corridors and the hollow silence of a home that no longer felt like his own. The walls of his marriage, once decorated with laughter and hope, now mocked him with reminders of what had been lost. The discarded wedding ring, the shattered photo frame, the absence of Portia's presence in their bedroom, each detail stabbed at him like 1,000 needles. Reminders of a love that had rotted into betrayal. Yet, what cut him deepest was not Portia's unfaithfulness alone, but the knowledge that Isaiah had been the one to exploit the cracks in their marriage. That his so-called friend had become the thief of his world. Stella, frail and confined to her hospital bed, became both the symbol of Isaiah's cruelty and the silent battlefield upon which this war played out. Her body had survived the stroke, but her spirit remained under siege. She lay tangled in the invisible threads of fear and manipulation that Isaiah spun so deftly. When Curtis visited, she reached for him with trembling hands, her eyes filled with confusion and shadows. She tried to speak, to tell him of the torment that plagued her dreams, but the words fell short, lost in the haze of Isaiah's quiet influence. Each time Curtis left her side, she fell back into the grip of nightmares, her mind replaying scenes Isaiah had whispered into her fragile consciousness, visions of abandonment, betrayal, and despair. For Curtis, it was torture to watch the woman who had raised him, guided him, and loved him become a pawn in Isaiah's sick game. Portia, meanwhile, spiraled in silence. She wanted to believe that what had happened with Isaiah was a moment of weakness, an accident born out of loneliness and despair. But each time she looked into a mirror, she saw not just a woman betrayed by circumstance but a woman complicit in her own undoing. She had let Isaiah close, let him strip her of vows she once held sacred, and in doing so, she had given him a weapon to wield against Curtis. Every encounter with Isaiah after that night became a reminder of her guilt. His glances lingered too long, his touches too familiar, and she knew that in yielding to him, she had surrendered not just her body but her ability to protect her marriage. The weight of shame gnawed at her, even as Isaiah whispered reassurances, convincing her that she had simply chosen comfort in a world that had abandoned her. Isaiah reveled in this dynamic. With Stella destabilized and Portia compromised, he had Curtis exactly where he wanted him, alone, vulnerable, and drowning in despair. Yet Isaiah's arrogance blinded him to the one truth he had overlooked. Curtis was a man who had spent his life enduring battles. He had survived betrayal before, survived violence, survived heartbreak, and though Isaiah thought he had broken him for good, Curtis still carried within him a reservoir of resilience. For now Curtis appeared hollow, as though stripped of everything he valued, but inside him, anger and grief simmered, slowly transforming into something sharper. Something Isaiah had failed to anticipate. Each time Curtis sat beside Stella's bed, listening to her fractured murmurs about fear and shadows, he began to piece together fragments of truth. Each time he revisited the broken silence of his home, he felt the bitter sting of betrayal hardening into resolve. Isaiah had taken everything from him: his family's trust, his wife's loyalty, his aunt's peace of mind, but in doing so, Isaiah had created an enemy with nothing left to lose. Curtis began to realize that his fight was no longer about defending what he had but about reclaiming what Isaiah had stolen. The enemy standing before him was not just Drew, whose vendetta had sparked the chaos, but Isaiah, whose ambition had devoured every sacred part of his life. Isaiah continued to parade his victory, too blinded by arrogance to notice the shifting tide. He still whispered poison into Stella's ears, still cloaked himself in false tenderness toward Portia, still smirked at Curtis's silent suffering. But beneath that smirk, he had unknowingly lit a fire. Curtis had been pushed beyond the brink, left to drown in ashes, and in that desolation, a new resolve was born. He would no longer play defense. He would no longer beg or plead or suffer in silence. For the first time, he began to see Isaiah not as a friend, not even as a rival, but as a usurper who had to be torn down piece by piece. Stella's survival became the anchor for Curtis's determination. Though she was weak, though her voice trembled and her mind was clouded, she was still alive, still capable of speaking truth if only she could gather the strength. Curtis vowed that he would be the strength she needed, that he would silence Isaiah's whispers and restore her peace. As for Portia, her betrayal cut deepest, but even in his pain, Curtis understood that she too was a victim of Isaiah's manipulation. He did not know if he could ever forgive her, but he knew he could not allow Isaiah to continue feeding on her weakness. Isaiah thought he had left Curtis standing among ruins, stripped of dignity and love. What he failed to see was that ruins can become battlegrounds, and ashes can fuel the flames of retribution. Curtis, once broken, now began to harden. He would bide his time, gather the truth, and when the moment came, he would strike with the precision of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. And so, as Isaiah walked with the swagger of a false victor, Curtis's silence was not submission, it was the sharpening of a blade, the quiet before a storm. Stella, though fragile, would one day awaken to expose the shadows Isaiah had cast. Portia, though guilty, would be forced to confront the reality of her choices. And Isaiah, basking in the illusion of conquest, would soon discover that victory built on betrayal is the most fragile victory of all. Stella lingered between life and death, her frail body a canvas of silent suffering and her mind a battlefield where reality and nightmare bled together in indistinguishable waves. Every rise and fall of her chest was a reminder of how fragile she had become, yet every flicker of her eyelids carried the stubborn spark of a woman who had endured far too much to surrender easily. Machines hummed steadily around her, measuring her fragile lifeline, but within her, the struggle was far more complex than any medical chart could capture. She was not simply recovering from a stroke, she was fighting a war of shadows seeded by Isaiah's whispers, a war that turned her sleep into a revolving door of betrayal and fear. In those dreams, Curtis abandoned her, Drew condemned her, and Portia's infidelity played on repeat like a cruel chorus. Isaiah had planted these illusions so carefully that Stella could not always separate truth from manipulation, leaving her caught in a twilight existence where despair ruled. Drew remained consumed by his thirst for vengeance, believing he was delivering justice to Curtis by using Stella as collateral damage. Yet in doing so, he had only provided Isaiah with the perfect opening. Drew's assaults were loud, overt, and destructive, but Isaiah thrived in subtlety. He slipped into cracks Drew had created, filling the void with his calculated charm and carefully masked cruelty. To Curtis, Drew was still the obvious enemy, but the greater danger lay in the man Curtis had once believed he could trust. Isaiah was not simply exploiting chaos, was shaping it, bending it to his will, until every piece of Curtis's life bore his fingerprints. Portia's turmoil deepened with each passing day. Her betrayal had not been born of passion alone, but of weakness, a moment where loneliness and despair had carved her open, and Isaiah had rushed in to fill the void. Yet, even after that night, her guilt did not free her from him. Instead, it shackled her more tightly. Isaiah made sure of it. He reminded her subtly that Curtis was too consumed with Stella, too hardened by his anger at Drew, to ever understand her pain. He made her feel justified, even comforted, in what she had done. Yet every time she saw Curtis's weary face, every time she stood in Stella's hospital room and watched the woman struggle to live, she felt her soul fracture a little more. The duality of desire and shame gnawed at her, leaving her trapped in an emotional prison that Isaiah controlled with precision. Curtis stood at the epicenter of this implosion, a man who had built his identity on strength and protection now hollowed by loss. His marriage lay in tatters, his end lay broken, and his enemy Drew seemed unstoppable. Worse still was the revelation that Isaiah, someone who had posed as a confidant, had become the silent architect of his devastation. Curtis visited Stella daily, sitting by her side, his hands trembling as they held hers. He whispered words of encouragement, though he no longer knew if she could hear him, and each visit ended with the same crushing uncertainty: would she ever waken fully? Or would she remain trapped in a state where Isaiah's poison had more power than truth? The helplessness ate at him, but beneath the weight of despair, something harder was beginning to form. The truth of Curtis's suffering was that grief had pushed him to the edge, but it was at that edge where men often find their sharpest resolve. Isaiah had underestimated what it meant to push a man past everything he held dear. To strip him of family, loyalty, and love was to strip away the last chains of fear. Curtis began to sense within himself not just the grief of loss, but the simmering ember of vengeance. Every time he saw Stella's fragile body tethered to machines, every time he felt the cold distance in Portia's eyes, every time he caught Isaiah's smug presence lingering too close, the ember burned hotter. He realized that he could no longer wait for salvation. If Stella was to survive, if Portia was to be freed from Isaiah's grasp, if Drew was to be stopped, it would fall on him to act not as the protector he once was, but as a warrior forged by betrayal. Stella herself was not entirely lost in her nightmares. Deep inside her mind, beneath the layers of Isaiah's whispers, her own truth stirred. She remembered his presence at her bedside, the words that pricked like needles, the way his voice slithered into her dreams. She remembered the moments she saw Portia's tears and Isaiah's hand brushing hers. Though frail, though trapped between consciousness and haze, Stella's spirit held onto these fragments like lifelines. She knew that if she could gather the strength to rise, she could expose Isaiah, could shatter the illusion he had so carefully built. But her body was weak, and the nightmares were relentless. Each attempt to speak dissolved into trembling silence. Each flicker of her eyelids brought the weight of exhaustion. Yet within her, the will to protect Curtis, to save her family, remained unbroken. Isaiah, blind in his arrogance, mistook silence for defeat. He saw Stella as too weak to resist, Curtis as too broken to fight, and Portia as too bound by guilt to break free. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed he had won, wearing a mask of concern that fooled those who didn't look closely enough. But his very arrogance became the seed of his downfall. He had underestimated Stella's will, Curtis's resilience, and the truth's ability to break through lies. For all his calculated moves, he had overlooked one fundamental truth: families fractured by betrayal can either collapse forever or rise from the ashes with a vengeance that no manipulator can withstand. The question that loomed, heavy and unanswered, was whether Stella would awaken in time to reveal what she knew, or whether Isaiah would silence her forever through fear and doubt. Curtis's future hung in the balance. If Stella remained lost in her nightmares, Isaiah's reign would continue unchallenged. But if she returned, even in weakness, her testimony could unravel everything Isaiah had built. Curtis knew this, and each day he sat at her bedside was a prayer, not only for her survival but for the chance to reclaim the truth. In that hospital room, 3 battles unfolded silently: Stella's battle to awaken, Curtis's battle to endure, and Isaiah's battle to maintain control. Portia stood caught between them all, her choices dangling like weights on a scale, threatening to tip the balance at any moment. The storm had not passed, it had only grown darker, heavier, and more dangerous. And in its eye stood Curtis, a man with nothing left but his determination to rise again, to face the men who had dismantled his world, and to fight for the only thing left worth saving, the truth that Stella carried within her fading breath.